I gave you an order, Lieutenant.
The cloning of animals has been a reality for a long time, but what if we could clone people? What would the medical uses of this technology be, and what kind of ethical repercussions would it have? Would clones have rights? Would they have a soul? And after you created a copy of yourself, would that diminish you in any way? Let's look at 4 Star Trek episodes that examine human cloning, starting with one of the best episodes of Enterprise, Similitude.
I have his memories. I have his feelings. I have his body. How am I not Trip?
We're in the middle of the Xindi arc, and this episode starts with a funeral. Commander Tucker is dead, Archer delivers the eulogy, and then we rewind several days to Trip tinkering with the engines, trying to push Enterprise to maintain Warp 5 for longer. When something goes wrong, there's an explosion, and Trip is severely injured in the process. When Phlox reports to Archer, he doesn't have anything good to say. Trip is in a coma with extensive neurodamage, and the doctor doesn't know if he can bring him back. But Phlox has a desperate idea. In his menagerie of alien creatures, he keeps something called a Lycerian desert lava, a mimetic symbiont with an unusual ability. If he supplies it with a sample of Trip's DNA, the larva will develop into a clone of Commander Tucker, a perfect copy of him in every way, except that the symbiont has an extremely accelerated lifespan.
It becomes a clone.
Essentially, but one that is born, grows old, and dies in approximately 15 days.
Phlox's plan is simple. Wait for the clone to age up and harvest neural tissue for a transplant to repair Trip's brain. The clone will survive the procedure and live out the rest of its short lifespan. T'Pol isn't so sure. The Lycerian government banned this practice precisely because the symbionts are sentient. You'd be creating a conscious being, a human being, who's destined to die in 2 weeks. But Archer is desperate.
I must complete this mission. And to do that, I need Trip. Trip!
Enterprise is stuck in a polaric field, engines offline, and they need their chief engineer. Backed against the wall in what is one of many impossible ethical decisions forced on him by his time in the Expanse, Captain Archer greenlights the procedure. Cloning a complex organism from an adult cell is not science fiction, it's established science. We've been doing it since 1996, when we created Dolly, the ship, with a process that's called a somatic nuclear cell transfer, or SCNT. Here's how it works. You take a cell from the organism you want to clone, for example a skin cell, and you remove the nucleus, which is the central part of the cell that contains the DNA inside the membrane. Then you need an egg cell, which you take from a female of the same species, in this case a sheep, and you also remove the nucleus of that cell. The next stage is put the nucleus with the DNA you want to clone inside the donor egg cell. After that you stimulate it with a little shock, and the cell begins dividing. If it works, you have an embryo that's genetically identical to the organism you want to clone. You put that embryo into a surrogate female, again of the same species, and 9 months later, or however long the gestation period is in that species, you have a clone. Similitude does away with the need for a surrogate, and Phlox grows the embryo in an artificial womb. But this episode distinguishes itself among stories about cloning because, with the exception of Captain Picard's clone in Nemesis, it's the only time in Star Trek in which the clone starts his life as a baby. Most cloning episodes cheat, giving us fully grown carbon copies of their adult models, but that's not how biology works. Cloning doesn't bypass development, it just resets the clock. And in my opinion, keeping true to this makes this particular story stronger.
3 days ago, he was just another one of your creatures. Something you kept on a shelf.
Now all I need to do is find him a name.
You see, in Enterprise, although the Lycerian symbiont can fast-forward the process, we get to watch Sim grow up, and as he does, the crew forms attachments with the boy. Phlox looks after him like a father. Hoshi reads him science fiction stories. Archer teaches him to fly model spaceships, and when he gets old enough, T'Pol gives him his first kiss. It soon becomes clear that Sim doesn't just have Trip's DNA, he also remembers Trip's memories, shares his engineering expertise, and eventually develops a plan to get the ship unstuck from the polaric field.
We just showed you this book. How do you know about the Martian machines?
My mom read it to me.
It's become quite evident that Sim's remarkable scholastic progress goes far beyond an aptitude for learning.
This part of the story stretches the science a bit. According to everything we know, memory is not stored in DNA, But the cool thing is that Enterprise doesn't simply hand-wave this away, explaining it as some sort of Lycerian symbiont magic. Actually, Phlox speculates in the episodes that the fact that Sim has Trip's memories is an indication that there might be some aspect of human memory that is encoded in DNA, which is not true according to everything we know, but it's nice that they wrote it in that way. And the point, of course, is that Sim is not just a genetic copy. He is Trip in many ways, and the older he gets, the harder it is to differentiate what thoughts and feelings are his, and which ones are actually remnants from Trip's life.
Was there ever anything between you and Trip? The reason I ask is, you're all I think about, if you know what I mean. And I'm not talking about an adolescent crush. That was 2 days ago. This is much more serious, the way I feel about you. Anyway, what's driving me crazy is I don't know if these feelings are mine or his.
Then the nightmare scenario hits. When he's about as old as the original Trip, Phlox discovers that the symbiont responds differently to human DNA. It's more fragile. Too fragile, indeed, to survive the transplant. If he harvests the material he needs to save Trip, the symbiont will not survive, and Sim doesn't want to die.
Then what am I? Just something you grew in a lab? Does that make it easier for you to condemn me to death?
Phlox says there's almost no chance that the enzyme will work.
My life is at stake! Any chance is worth taking!
Think about that for a second. You are 8 days old, but you have a lifetime of memories. You have skills, relationships, hopes and fears. You know who you are. You remember your first day at Starfleet Academy, your first assignment, the friends you've lost, the promises you made. You are alive and conscious, and someone just told you that in a couple of days they're going to cut into your brain and kill you to save someone else. Here's the moral dilemma then. Is it moral to create a life whose sole purpose is to save somebody else? This isn't entirely hypothetical. We already do something very close to this in modern medicine. It's called Saviour siblings. Saviour siblings are children conceived specifically with the purpose of providing a donation for an older sibling. Take Fanconi anemia. This is a rare genetic disorder characterized by congenital malformations. Specifically, they have radial axis malformations, that is, malformations of the thumb, but also bone marrow failure and a variety of cancers. A bone marrow transplant is a curative treatment, and there's a higher chance of success if the transplant comes from a sibling who is a compatible donor. Because of that, some couples that have a child with Fanconi anemia choose to have a second child, this time through in vitro fertilization, and they select the embryo based not only on the embryo being healthy, but also in it being a compatible donor for the elder sibling. This practice does raise profound ethical questions. In medical ethics, there are 4 core principles. In my video about Gattaca, the science fiction movie from the 90s, we talked a lot about the principle of autonomy, the right a person has to make choices about their own body. Here, another principle comes into play, the principle of non-maleficence, that is, the duty to do no harm. When you bring a child into the world, specifically with the purpose of being a donor for a sibling, are you violating that principle? The child cannot possibly consent to being created for that purpose. And while the initial donations are harmless, for example the donation of cord blood, what happens if they're calling on to donate again and again? At what point does this become exploitation? More troubling yet, what happens to the psychological well-being of a child who knows that the only reason they were born is so that they could donate something of themselves for an older sibling? That their value, at least initially, was instrumental, they were a means to an end. Similitude takes this real ethical dilemma and pushes it to the absolute extreme. Sim wasn't created to die, but that is what it's going to take. Does the fact that he only has a few more days of life ahead of him make it okay to abbreviate his life? Things get even more complicated when Sim's research uncovers a controversial treatment that may extend his life for several years. But it's risky. Attempting the treatment means giving up on the transplant that could save Trip's life, and if the treatment doesn't work, they will have lost them both. Once again, Captain Archer faces a difficult decision, and I think it says a lot about who he is as a captain that he doesn't hand off the decision of Phlox, chalking it up as a medical matter.
So what are you gonna do? Drag me down to sick bay? Force me onto a biobed at gunpoint? You're not a murderer.
Don't make me one.
In the end, Sim chooses to volunteer for the procedure. Phlox performs the transplant, saving Trip and ending Sim's life. In some ways, this story is a classic science fiction story because there is a long history of exploring the repercussions of cloning, and specifically of cloning as a way of providing surplus body parts for transplants. But Star Trek also takes some of its episodes to more unexpected places, and in Deep Space Nine we ask, what happens when someone creates a clone not to save a life, but to commit the perfect crime?
The law. Commander, laws change depending on who's making them. Cardassians one day, Federation the next. But justice is justice.
Early in Deep Space Nine's first season, when the station is still finding its footing under Federation management and Odo is still an outsider, a Bajoran named Ibudan arrives on the station. Ibudan and Odo have history. Years ago, during the occupation, Odo arrested Ibudan for murdering a Cardassian officer. Murdering a Cardassian isn't seen as much of a crime anymore, however, which is why Ibudan is free. But both him and Odo harbor a profound despise for one another. So when Ibudan turns up dead in a holosuite, stabbed to death, suspicion naturally falls on the constable.
Cause of death's no mystery. The knife was thrust directly between the left and right thoracic vertebrae. The murderer apparently had a decent knowledge of Bajoran anatomy.
The evidence seems damning. Odo had motive, opportunity, and no alibi. He was regenerating in his bucket during the time of the murders. Worse yet, the holosuite shows no sign that someone other than Ibudan ever walked in, so the crime would have to be committed by someone who could slide through the cracks in the door, someone like a shapeshifter. The Bajorans at the station begin to turn against him. A mob forms outside his quarters. For a brief, ugly moment, we see how quickly fear and prejudice can override reason.
What the hell do you people intend to accomplish here? We want the shapeshifter! What do you think you're going to do to him if you get to him?
It's Dr. Bashir who discovers something that cracks open the investigation. He has found the remains of a biological sample container in Ibudan's quarters, and although it looks like the man was conducting some sort of experiment, Bashir can't quite tell what it was. He grows the substance in culture, and before long, everything becomes clear.
My god. Dax, I think I know what it is. Run a chromosome analysis. I think we're gonna find a gene sequence degradation.
Ibudan made a clone of himself. He murdered his clone for the sole purpose of framing Odo for the crime.
Killing your own clone is still murder.
This episode could have raised questions about the legal status of clones. If someone creates a clone of themselves and then kills that clone, what crime has been committed? Is it murder? Or more disturbingly, is it destruction of property? Does a clone have the same legal rights as a naturally born person? What responsibilities does the creator bear towards their clone? However, this story doesn't really go there, and once he's found out, Ibudan is quickly arrested. Murdering your own clone, Odo says, is still murder, and nobody has any doubt about that. The thing that's the most surprising about this episode is that after Julian discovers that the thing growing in his sickbay is a clone of Ibudan, he doesn't stop the process. In fact, when Cisco asks him about it, Julian cheerfully says that in a few more days the clone, a fully adult clone mind you, will become a functioning member of Bajoran society. So he's just going to send the clone of a convicted murderer back into the world? Will he have Ibudan's memories? Where will he live? What will he do? Will he know how to talk, how to walk? And if he doesn't, who's gonna teach all that? There are far too many unanswered questions. But this is very early in Deep Space Nine's first season, so I think we can give it a pass. Okay, so now we've looked at individual clones created for specific purposes. Let's look at what you do when you build an entire society made of clones.
Recognize it. Sounds like it might be an SOS.
Up the Long Ladder begins with the Enterprise receiving an old-fashioned SOS, sent using a code that hasn't been used since the 22nd century by an Earth group known as the European Hegemony, Earth's first draft of a unified world government. Data and the captain determined that whoever sent the signal must be the descendants of the crew of the SS Mariposa, a 22nd century ship that launched towards the Ficus sector with a most unusual mix of cargo listed in its manifest. Not only were they carrying high-end computers, beacon satellites, and cellular comlinks, but also livestock and retrograde technology like spinning wheels. Shortly after the Enterprise reaches the Ficus system, that insane mix of cargo is explained. The SS Mariposa was carrying two distinct groups of people who settled on separate planets. The first was a group of scientists who built a Mariposa colony using the advanced technology they brought with them on the ship. The second settled on a Class M world in the Bringloid system, half a light year away from Mariposa. They were adopters of the philosophy of neo-transcendentalism, a movement that existed on Earth during the 22nd century when the world was still recovering from the Third World War. The neo-transcendentalists advocate a return to a simpler life in which one lived in harmony with nature and learned under her gentle tutelage. It's those people who carried spinning wheels and livestock to their new world. The distress signal came from a satellite placed in orbit around Bringloid 5 and was sent when the intensity of solar flare activity started to threaten the viability of life on that planet. The colony is small, a mere 300 people, and the Enterprise is able to beam all of them to safety before heading to Mariposa, only to discover that their world is also in danger, albeit from a very different threat.
Tell me, is your entire population made up of clones, Prime Minister?
When the Mariposa landed, the ship suffered a catastrophic hull breach, leaving only 5 people alive on the planet. Because they were all scientists, and because 5 people were not a sufficient number with which to repopulate their colony, those scientists decided to build their civilization with clones, so that everybody on the planet is a clone of those initial survivors. 200 years later, however, they're in trouble because of a problem Pulaski describes as replicative fading. Essentially, she says, every time you clone a cell from an existing cell, there are some genetic errors as a consequence of the process. Over time, these errors accumulate because you are cloning from a clone every time, and after a few generations, the clones cannot survive. Now, replicative fading isn't a real thing, it's Star Trek technobabble, but the underlying concept has a basis in real cloning issues. One of the biggest problems with cloning is the inability to reproduce epigenetic reprogramming. Your DNA contains the genetic code, but that's not the whole story. You also have epigenetic markers. These are chemical modifications to the DNA that do not alter the sequence of the bases. And these markers accumulate throughout life. Some are specific to gender, some happen because of stress, there's a number of reasons. When we reproduce, our cells go through a certain degree of epigenetic reprogramming so that the new individual starts with a fresh slate. When you clone an adult cell, the epigenetic reprogramming is imperfect. Incomplete reprogramming leads to problems like premature aging and health issues. Dolly, the sheep, for example, developed premature arthritis and lung disease at a young age. And there was some debate about whether this was simply due to her being a clone, due to some bad luck, or if it raised concerns about cloning, whether or not the clone inherits some of the biological age of the donor. Now imagine doing this repeatedly, cloning a clone from a clone from a clone. Each iteration introduces more opportunities for errors. The Mariposans have been doing this for 200 years. They are more than a few generations deep into copied copies, and they're running out of time. In the story, Wilson Granger, president of the Mariposa colony, requests the genetic material of people from the Enterprise so that their colony can survive for a few more generations. What he wants is a fresh infusion of genetic material, clones of the Enterprise crew, but upon hearing the request, Riker immediately rejects the idea. Granger insists that the procedure is safe, but for Riker, it's not a question of safety. Rather, he's worried about the loss of his own uniqueness.
One William Riker is unique, perhaps even special. But 100 of him, 1,000 of him, diminishes me in ways I can't even imagine.
As he puts it, he's not just a collection of genes. He's a lifetime of experiences, choices, and relationships that make him who he is. The idea of someone else walking around with his face, his voice, even his genetic predispositions feels like a violation. The Mariposans don't accept no for an answer though. They secretly take tissue samples from Riker and Dr. Pulaski and begin growing clones without consent. The plan is only discovered because they didn't take a sample from Geordi, presumably because his blindness made him an unsuitable genetic candidate.
Geordi, you'll be pleased to know that you're not missing any epithelial cells.
Great.
Will and I, however, are.
When Riker discovers the theft, he beams down immediately and destroys the clones himself. By the time Will finds his clone, there's already an adult copy of himself inside what looks like a chamber of some sort, and that begs the question, did he just commit murder? The episode doesn't really engage with that question. I suppose, since the clones were still in chambers, we're meant to assume that the cloning process was not complete and they were not alive yet. There's also the fact that Will's outrage is easy to relate to and easy to understand. But it's worth pointing out that not everybody shares his attitude, even within the Star Trek universe. There's a point in the observation room, I think, when it seems like Deanna would have been open to the idea of donating her genetic material. And we know that when Canisius 5 created an oversized clone of Mr. Spock, Spock's instinct wasn't to destroy his double. Instead, he wished him well when he left his copy in the planet to work with Canisius, and the crew of the Cerritos even found his skeleton in the collection of Kerner House in the 24th century.
I would suggest Dr. Canisius remain on Phylos with my duplicate. My thoughts exactly, Mr. Spock. The concerted efforts of both scientists may yet achieve a rebirth of the Philosian civilization.
Back to the episode. Instead of letting things escalate, Captain Picard tries to negotiate a different solution with President Granger. The Bringloid, he argues, have also been displaced. Perhaps the two colonies, which started together in a way, can be brought together once more, solving all of their problems. After all, traditional reproduction would certainly bypass the replicative fading issue. Granger is skeptical because, in his world, the idea of traditional reproduction, which at first they suppressed with a combination of drugs and punitive laws, has become repugnant.
For 300 years we have denied the carnal side of our nature. How can we learn to put that aside?
Well, you put a young couple together, and you let nature take its course.
Ultimately, however, both sides agree to give this solution a try. This episode gets a lot of flack for several different reasons, and the original commentary it was intending to make was certainly lost in the final product. But I think it deserves a little credit for what it added to Star Trek lore in terms of different philosophies that existed on Earth prior to the founding of the Federation. I also think the idea of a society of clones is a good science fiction concept to explore, and it's nice that they are using it to talk about the value of human uniqueness and whether or not having a copy of oneself diminishes you in any way. It's also perfect that they chose Riker to be the voice of that discomfort, because that wouldn't be the last time he would stand in front of another Will Riker.
I'm Commander William Riker from the Federation Starship Enterprise. That's not possible. I'm Will Riker.
In Second Chances, the Enterprise is orbiting Nervala 4, a planet that used to be the site of a research station that had to be evacuated 8 years prior. They hope to retrieve scientific data left on the station, but the mission is tricky because the planet has distortion fields that make transport impossible, apart from very brief windows over a handful of days. The last ship there was the Potemkin, back when Commander Riker was still a lieutenant, and he remembers barely making out of the planet on account of the distortion field. When Data, Riker, Worf, and an engineer beam down to the station, however, they find signs that there's someone living there, and when the humanoid reveals his presence, the away team finds themselves standing across from another Will Riker. Dr. Crusher determines that Riker's duplicate was generated by a transporter accident. Because of the distortions, while one Will Riker materialized back on the Potemkin, a second copy of his pattern materialized down on the station, stranded and completely cut off from the Federation, living as a castaway for the past 8 years. Up until that moment, they were one person. From that point onwards, though, Commander Riker and Lieutenant Riker led very different lives. The Will that beamed back was promoted and eventually transferred to the Enterprise. The one that remained lived a life of scarcity and isolation, struggling each day to survive. This is one of the great episodes of The Next Generation, one that would plant the seeds for a story that would pop up in the future in Deep Space Nine. The crew of the Enterprise D is a tight-knit group. At times, they feel more like a family, and when they first encounter Lieutenant Riker, all of them are cautious and protective of their own Will as the real one. Once it becomes clear who he is and how he came into existence, Picard suggests that he is something like Will's long-lost twin, and they should do their best to make him feel at home. Will himself, meanwhile, is clearly struggling with the loss of uniqueness against which he spoke all the way back in Up the Long Ladder in the second season. There's something else that complicates this picture. Diana. At this point in The Next Generation, we know Will and Diana used to be romantically involved. We learned that all the way back in Encounter at Farpoint in the first season. We also know Will's professional ambitions were at least part of what stood between them, and they agreed not to reignite their romance while serving on the same ship, and that they're very close friends. It is only in this episode, though, that we get the specifics of how they first broke up. The day Will started his tour on the Potemkin, he and Diana said goodbye at the Janaran Falls on Betazed. They were supposed to meet in Rises 6 weeks later, but Commander Riker earned a promotion very quickly for his work at the very station where Lieutenant Riker became trapped. Rather than meeting Diana again, he chose to make his career a priority. She was broken-hearted. They kept in touch, but didn't see each other again until they were both posted on the Enterprise, and things never went back to how they used to be. But now there's another Will Riker on board, one that was stuck in time before he could ever make the decision not to put Diana first, dreaming of a day when he might see her again. And just like that, a new love triangle is formed. Will has to watch from the sidelines, recognizing in Diana's eyes a look that used to be reserved for him, examining his past choices and his regrets while trying to parse his jealousy from the genuine concern he has for her, from not wishing to see her hurt again. Lieutenant Riker is a broken man, trying to put himself back together in a world that not only moved on without him, but has a copy of himself whose life was never halted by tragedy. And then there's Diana, suddenly transported back to the girl she was when she believed Will and her would last forever, trying to separate her feelings for both men and trying to understand just how much of Lieutenant Riker's feelings are genuine, how much of it is him trying to win something over his transporter twin, and whether his time on Nervala 4 changed the part of him that would choose his career ahead of her. Ultimately, Diana is presented with the same choice Will had years ago. Lieutenant Riker has been posted to the USS Gandhi, so following him would mean losing all that she built on board the Enterprise. And Diana chooses to stay. She doesn't put a definitive end to anything, but there's a goodbye involving the three of them when Will gifts his trombone to his duplicate, and the lieutenant tells them that he has decided to go by the name of Thomas. Will is surprised at that because he never cared about that name, and although Thomas smiles, every time I watch I get the distinct impression that he doesn't care for the name either. He's just stuck with it, much as he's stuck with so many other things.
Take it. You always had the better hand in everything.
The story of Thomas Riker doesn't end here. He appears again in Deep Space Nine's Defiant, where his bitterness and isolation have transformed him into something his Enterprise counterparts never became. A member of the Maquis, willing to steal a starship and risk war to fight for what he believes in, or what he has convinced himself he believes in, so that his life can have some meaning. It's a reminder that we're not just our genetics or even our memories. We are also the sum of our experiences, and 8 years of solitude can change a person in profound ways. Across these 4 episodes, Star Trek uses cloning to explore fundamental questions about identity, autonomy, and the value of individual human life. Similitude asks whether it's ethical to create a person for the sole purpose of saving another. A Man Alone suggests that we consider whether a clone has the same legal and moral status as their genetic original. Up the Long Ladder examines what we lose when we abandon genetic diversity and sexual reproduction, and Second Chances reminds us that even 2 people with identical genes and memories can become entirely different individuals based on the lives they lead. These episodes also place Star Trek next to a roster of stories that explore the ramifications of cloning in the context of science fiction, like Brave New World, The Boys from Brazil, Star Wars, and Jurassic Park. But perhaps one of the most beautiful and heartbreaking explorations of this topic is the soft science fiction movie Never Let Me Go, based on the novel of the same name, written by Kazuo Ishiguro.
It had never occurred to me that our lives, which had been so closely interwoven, could unravel with such speed. If I'd known, maybe I'd have kept tighter hold of them, and not let unseen tides pull us apart.
Never Let Me Go takes place in a future in which clones are generated to serve as donors of organs and body parts. Much like Similitude, these cloned children start lives as babies, and we follow the lives of 3 of them as they are raised in a special boarding school called Haoshan. They remain there until they turn 18, at which point they are transferred to adult cottages and prepare to begin their donations, which will invariably bring about the premature end of their lives in their early adult years, a process they call completion. Stories like this do what science fiction does best, taking a realistic scenario to its logical extreme and creating a situation in which the donors are literally sacrificed to provoke us into thinking about questions of bodily autonomy and the instrumentalization of the human body. But Never Let Me Go distinguishes itself from other stories of the same kind, because instead of an action thriller where people are trying to flee and stay alive, this movie is largely about the clones trying to come to terms with the meaning of their lives. What does it say about your identity that you are created from the genetic material of a criminal you will never meet? Is your life worth any less if your purpose was always to save somebody else? How do you face the inevitability of an early death, and what does that say about the meaning of your own life?
What I'm not sure about is if our lives have been so different from the lives of the people we save. We all complete. Maybe none of us really understand what we've lived through, or feel we've had enough time.
These aren't just abstract philosophical questions. As cloning technology advances, as artificial wombs become more feasible, as we gain more control over human reproduction and genetic engineering, we will need to grapple with these questions. Star Trek doesn't always provide the answers, but it does what the best science fiction always do. It holds up a mirror to our present and asks us to think carefully about the future we're creating. Interestingly enough, through all of these episodes, we never hear anything about a Federation policy towards human cloning, which is the opposite of how they treat genetic engineering and human enhancement. But if you want to hear about that, then watch my video on genetic engineering of Star Trek next. This is it for now. Thank you for watching, and until next time, live long and prosper.